I'm visiting with Sheila Silver today. She's joining us from the Opera Center adjacent to McCaw Hall, site of the February 25th world premiere of A Thousand Splendid Suns. It's great to have you with us, Sheila. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be here.
Part of the interest in the opera comes from the fact that you are a native of this part of the world, born in Seattle in 1946. Would you take us through your formative years, how you decided to be a composer, your studies, your influences?
Well, when I was a little girl, my mother was a violinist. So the music was in the family. And my father, of course, listened to classical music all the time. He loved opera, actually. And I badgered my mother for piano lessons. And on the first day of first grade, she let me have my first piano lesson. My teacher was Mary Varish. I don't know if there's Seattleites who will remember her, but I want to honor her today because that was my first piano teacher. And John T. Moore was a professor at the University of Washington, and I went to study with him for 2 years. And then it was at that point that I started to have interest in composing. There was no vision that women could be a composer. I could be for women it was available to be a pianist. Women could be musicologists. And at one point I saw this girl coming out of a class, and I said, what class were you in? And she said that was the composition seminar. And I said, you mean girls can take composition? And she looked at me like I was crazy, and she said, yes.
This would have been around 1964 or 65.
This was exactly 1964, yes. So then I went through my music studies, but the next year, Bill Balcom was my theory teacher.
William Balcom, who is a well-known pianist and composer, and another Seattle native.
Another Seattle native. I was in the honors music program, so I had to do a special project for Bill. And he said, okay, go write something. So I wrote this sonata that was kind of went from Schubert to Bartok. I don't know, but I didn't know what I was doing, but I wrote something, and that was fine. And then I decided it was time for me to move on. And I did a junior year abroad in Paris, and then when I was done with that, I went back to UC Berkeley. That was where all the action was, and that was in the 60s. That was a place to be. And then I wrote Ligeti a letter.
So this was after you graduated from Berkeley in 1968.
Berkeley. So I wrote him a letter. He said, and I'm not actually teaching, but if you want to come and visit me, I can look at your music and maybe make some suggestions. So I went to visit him. He said he wanted me to go study with Erhard Karkoschka in Stuttgart. He called him up on the phone. He said, I have this American composer here. I want you to take her as a student, because he thought he had a really good, interesting class there. So off I went with my suitcases to Stuttgart, Germany, where I studied with Erhard Karkoschka at the Hochschule für Musik for the remainder of my 2-year fellowship, which was another year and a half. And then I went to Brandeis University, where I graduate program.
And you got your PhD there in 1976. And you then taught at SUNY Stony Brook for many years. And
yes,
today you're living in upstate New York.
Yes. And I'll say this about my, Germany was the days of Stockhausen and Donaueschingen and all these incredible festivals, and Darmstadt, that I went to all these things and met so many interesting musicians. And when I was in Germany, I had no technique, but I had ideas. And then when I got to Brandeis, I got a lot of technique. And then I became my own person. After all the schooling, you have to kind of let it all go and find out who you are.
So besides Ligeti, and you mentioned Stockhausen, and
Yeah.
we're going to hear some Stockhausen later in the program, were there any other composers whose influence you might have heard in, say, the Piano Concerto, which we just listened to?
Well, my music has always been a mixture of the atonal world I was raised in and the tonal world that I yearned for. And I have always kind of tried to find the balance between the two of them.
So the Piano Concerto, which in its entirety, it lasts 45 minutes. It's quite epic in its scope.
It's very epic. It's very epic.
That seems to be a theme in your work, doesn't it?
Yes, it is. It was a theme of that period particularly.
1996 is when it was completed.
Yes. And I was very involved, very moved and exposed to Hasidic Jewish music, prayer music. so the epicness of the piano concerto ends with a nigun, an original nigun that I wrote, which is a Jewish prayer melody for the final movement. And for those who remember the image of the movie Zorba the Greek, did you ever see that movie?
Yes, the dance on the
beach. The dance on the beach
Anthony
at
Quinn.
The end. You kind of give it up to God. It's like that you've had all these terrible things happen, but you still choose life, and that's hope. And I think all of my music chooses hope.
And that brings us nicely to A Thousand Splendid Suns,
yes.
which is currently playing at Seattle Opera in its premiere engagement. And you've spoken a lot about that project already, its origins, the story itself, and there are interviews online at seattleopera.org, which I encourage people to check out. So I would like to approach this a bit differently. Lauren Marshall, who is a playwright based here in Seattle, has said that when contemplating setting a narrative story as an opera with opera singers and an orchestra, you want to have answers to two questions. One is, why should it be sung? And the other is, why should it be sung like that?
Okay. Why should it be sung? That's easy. For me, an opera has to have a driving story, and it has to have human emotions larger than life. You have to have a reason why they're singing and not just talking. And so it's really about the inner emotional life of the characters, and it has to be so powerful that the composer is drawn into that world. It was my job as composer to write the music that Mariam and Laila are feeling as they go through this journey of their life.
And you mentioned emotions larger than life, story larger than life. Is that what draws you toward full-throated operatic voices as opposed to a more of a musical theater kind of voice? Because your librettist has done both kinds of theater.
Yes, he has. Yeah, I mean, I'm living in the classical world. I like too much dissonance to be a music theater composer. I love music theater. I love it. I love Sondheim. And I was raised on Rodgers and Hammerstein, and I love that music, but it isn't me.
A prominent feature of the music in the opera is that it's indebted to North Indian classical music, the Hindustani tradition, which you've been studying in India.
I guess this is the answer, and why should it be sung that way, right? When I first started, I didn't know what kind of sound world I was going to have. I got the rights from Khaled Hosseini. Okay, now what's next? Okay, well, what is the sound world that I should have? And I said I should go learn more about Hindustani music, because that's the classical music of all of South Asia, including Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, etc. So the intention was never to write Hindustani music. I'm writing Western music for Western singers who have Western techniques. They approach things in a Western way, and they don't sound at all like a Hindustani musician. I'm not going to try to make them sound like a Hindustani musician. That's not my goal.
These singers don't sound particularly South Asian, but you've got two musicians, in addition to a fairly standard orchestra with a large percussion section, who play South Asian instruments. Right.
Well, it starts before that, because every single aria except for one, and almost all of the music, even the fight music, are all based on either on Hindustani ragas, as well as Hindustani rhythmic patterns. I learned maybe 15 ragas, maybe 10 ragas really well. But before I wrote any aria, I would sing that raga for a few days, and then I would close the book, and then I would write. And a raga is more identified by certain melodic patterns than it is by the actual notes of the scale.
So a raga is based on a scale of which there are perhaps 9 or 10 that are commonly used, but it's also a collection of melodic formulas and stock phrases that define the raga, also associated with the time of day.
Right. Yes, time of day, and they all have spiritual meanings. So once I had developed the themes coming from these ragas, I had material for which to develop the whole opera. And using ragas caused me to make different choices melodically than I ever would have made otherwise. And using ragas really encouraged me to dwell within the world of tonality in a different way.
Sheila Silver is our guest on Flotation Device, composer, Seattle native, and the musical force behind A A Thousand Splendid Suns, currently in its world premiere production at Seattle Opera. Tickets and more information are at seattleopera.org. Sheila, what you were saying about how working with North Indian ragas allowed you to approach tonal music in a new way reminded me of Aaron Copland talking about how working with 12-tone technique allowed him to find atonal chords and melodies that he wouldn't have thought of otherwise. Kind of a mirror image of your experience with ragas.
Yes, it is. And it helped me use things I wouldn't never have otherwise.
Now, there's one raga that's especially prominent in the opera.
Yes.
The raga Bilashkani Dodi.
Yes.
We hear it at the beginning of Act 1, which is what's been playing in the background. It uses an interesting scale. It's very close to what in Western music we call Phrygian mode, which you can get by playing the white keys on a piano, starting with E.
Sa re ga pa da ma pa da ni sa. Sa re ga pa da
Your voice is lovely. I apologize for the Zoom audio, but you were singing in Sargam, Indian solfege.
I started to, and then I just went to the ah. So I used that raga a lot because it was one of the first ones I learned, and maybe it was inherently comfortable to me because it was Phrygian, but maybe it's also, I don't feel like it was I feel it's very calm, and I use it a lot in the opera, and it comes back all over, and it always comes in prayer, it comes in calmness, it never comes in agitation.
I see, and that music from the beginning of the opera that we were hearing is indeed calm. And it's also a good place to hear the bansuri, the Indian bamboo flute that's held sideways like a Western flute. It doesn't have keys, but it can bend pitches quite easily.
Yes. I understood the bansuri more because there was a bansuri player in our class, and he came every day, and I listened to it every day. I listened to him practice, so I had a good sense of what they could do. And Steve Gorin, our bansuri player, he doesn't play one flute, he plays about 8 or 9 flutes, and the bansuri player in a concert will never switch flutes. And so one of the biggest challenges is for him to pick one up and play and be in tune, and then pick up another one and play and be in tune, because they tune into their, they have a drone going, they play in the same key all night long, right? And it sounds, in tune. And he said, and I'm treating him like a Western, like a go between an oboe and English horn, you switch off, that's kind of unfair to him. But he sounds, there are sections where he's improvising, and there's sections where it's strictly notated. So I had to create the spaces where he's improvising, and even the spaces where he's improvising, a basic melody is notated. Using the bansuri is the most successful when the orchestration is very thin, and he can be solo, or he can sit on top of a drone. It's a big problem to mic the voice, the bansuri, and we don't. And without picking up everybody else, we haven't exactly mastered that challenge. We're doing okay with it, but I think
he's in a sound booth, as is your tabla player.
Tabla, yes.
He's often driving up tempo music, often in 7-time.
Yes. He is giving an incredible amount of rhythmic detail that's just, it's unnotatable. That's all I can say. He said he's going to notate the score in syllables. That's because that's their notation, is syllables.
Tabla players have their own. Yeah. It's like solfege, but it's different sounds that you can create on the instrument.
Yes. Deep Singh, the tabla player, also is, he does a lot of jazz and other things. So he's a very crossover. They're both crossover artists, and that's why they can do this part.
Besides the Indian elements, were you influenced by any contemporary Western operas like Ligeti's Le Grand Macabre?
No, I did see Le Grand Macabre, but I would say that my Ligeti influenced my language. I think the drones come right out of Ligeti. I mean that the counterpoint that Ligeti does in those masks of sound. Mm-hmm. If you look at the detail, it's all contrapuntal things moving around in there.
He always heard things very precisely.
Yeah. And I mean, he's the master of textures, right? And I have created drones out of textures, so I think that those drones are very influenced by him. The influence. You want to know who's influenced my writing as an opera composer? I mean, they're all classic. I mean, it's Peter Grimes,
Benjamin Britten,
the Magic Flute, Dalla Piccola's Uh,
Ulysses?
no, the other one, the one
El Prisionero, the prisoner.
Il Prigioniero. Dalla Piccola's Prigioniero is a great inspiration to me. Verdi's Otello, and I love Tosca.
Puccini.
I love Tosca, and I love Traviata. You know, and Otello, and my last opera is going to be a comedy.
Can I ask you about Otello? Because in Otello, the main character murders his spouse, then upon realizing his crime, he commits suicide, whereupon the opera ends in E major.
It's always strange. It's always still a bit strange, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, he's kind of righted the wrong, I suppose. And your opera ends in major after the main character murders her spouse, justifiably, but nevertheless knowing that it's going to result in her death.
Yeah, but she made a choice. She made a choice, a heroic choice. I would not call that suicide at all. She made a choice, and she took action. And in the opera, her character changes after she's killed Rashid. She's the one that takes charge of Laila. Says, "You are leaving. I'm staying. Somebody has to pay for this. You know, I killed our husband, I killed our husband, but I saved your life." And so the reason that it ends in major, because the final aria is abundant peace is washing over me, filling me with joy. I know God will forgive me. It is not so bad to die this way.
We're talking with composer Sheila Silver about her opera A Thousand Splendid Suns, which has just been premiered by Seattle Opera. And unfortunately, since it is a premiere, we don't have a full recording to play for you. You'll have to go see it yourself. Upcoming performances are on Friday, March 3rd, Wednesday, March 8th, and Saturday, March 11th, all three of those at 7:30 p.m., as well as a matinee on Sunday, March 5th at 2 p.m. Arrive an hour early to hear Sheila talk about the piece.
I do a show and tell before the pre-concert talk, yeah.
And that's free to ticket holders, and tickets and information are available at seattleopera.org. And if you can't make a performance, King FM will be rebroadcasting the opera on Saturday morning, April 22nd, 2023 at 10 a.m. King.org is the streaming URL. You're allowed to tune into King FM for that one occasion. Just tune it back to KBCS afterwards, okay? We have one more piece of yours to listen to.
Yes.
It's called Twilight's Last Gleaming. It's for 2 pianos and 2 percussionists. And you mentioned Bartók earlier. Well, this duplicates the instrumentation of his famous sonata for that combination.
Absolutely. Tribute to Bartók, absolutely.
It's in 3 movements, of which we'll hear the third. You composed it between 2005 and 2007, and the title suggests a war reference, doesn't it?
Well, it was about the Iraq War.
Mm-hmm.
And Twilight's Last Gleaming comes from the Star Spangled Banner, and
we'll hear a quotation from the Star Spangled Banner in the piece.
In the third movement. The titles: War Approaching, Souls Ascending, Peace Pretending, were the names of the movements. And the first one is about the guns and the things rolling over these big American tanks that love to go everywhere. And the second one is all the dead bodies strewn across the desert and the souls ascending. And the third one is, we pretend we want peace, but it doesn't seem to me like we want very much peace if we've been at war, nothing but war for all these years.
You wrote this after the Iraq War, after the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan.
Yes, and we live in a patriarchal society where bully men like to make war. And it's good for business, good for corporations. People make a lot of money at war. And they build guns cost a lot of money, and we as taxpayers pay for them, and people die, and lives are at stake. And it's, I think we need to get rid of patriarchy. It's time for women to run the world. I don't think women would make as much war. They don't like to see their sons die.
A social perspective that's also present in A Thousand Splendid Suns by my guest, Sheila Silver, who joined us today from Seattle Opera, which is giving that work its premiere production. Whence come the excerpts from it that we've been playing, conducted by Viswa Subaraman. Sheila, thanks so much for joining us. Congratulations for successfully bringing forth this ambitious project, and we hope to see you again in Seattle very soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's great to be back in Seattle, and great to have this opera premiered in my hometown. It really is very, very special. And thank you so much.